Our next speaker excels in the knowledge of this area and these two particular areas, and I would like to introduce to you. She's now the chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, representing the northern, pretty much the northern 1/3 of the world, the global. Talk about the global north. That's it. If you think it's -35 in cold air, you haven't been up to our country yet. It's about just around +8. So Dalee, please welcome Dalee Sambo Dorough.
Yeah, it's a dry cold. It sucks the moisture right out of you, so I had to get a glass of water. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this territory, the Treaty 1 people, and also the elders, Norm, who was here earlier, Norm Mead and others. Thank you very much for allowing me to be on your territory and in this region. Also the organizers of the event, in particular Laura, as well as Celeste and Brenda. There was one other woman, I think it was a Helen. I wanted to extend a thanks, especially to Laura, who was extremely responsive and helpful in arranging all the travel, because I have some back-to-back things that I have to take care of. So after this, I head to Tromsø, Norway, first thing in the morning. So I'm trying to squeeze a lot in a short period of time. I was invited some time ago, but more recently was told what I should cover. So I don't have any prepared remarks, but I do have a PowerPoint, and I'm going to give an introduction, a very elementary introduction to the various different Indigenous-specific mechanisms that have been established at the United Nations. And then, if I have time, give you a little snapshot of some of the issues that we're facing in the Arctic region. As was stated by Ed, I was recently elected, July 19th, as the international chair of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. So I'm the leader of my people, which is a daunting task because of what Ed said, that we're approximately 40% of the Arctic region. And as many of you know, especially here in Canada, there's a growing and intense interest in everything to do with the Arctic. Every single academic institution now has an Arctic program. Every person certainly with a background in security issues, environmental issues, you name it, there's a growing interest. And so things are ramping up pretty quickly, and my job is it's a big job. And I'll try to talk about some of the issues facing the Arctic region and the Inuit in particular. So as Ed said, at Takakpunga, I'm Dalee Sambo Dorough from Alaska. Many of you know that the Inuit are in the Chukotka region of the Russian Far East, throughout the northwest and northern coast of Alaska, all throughout the Canadian Arctic and the west and east coast of Greenland. I've been involved in this work for decades, and it's so good to see many of the people that I have locked arms with at the international level here in the crowd. And given the nature of this seminar, teaching and learning, it's always good to learn from those that I have linked arms with in the trenches at the UN and the OAS and the ILO and elsewhere. And it's also important that the young people here in the room have an extraordinary opportunity to learn from a lot of these elders here. I was taken by some of the opening remarks about the need for new systems, when in fact we're really talking about old systems, and revitalizing all of our worldviews and perspectives through our language, which was also raised. And I think that that is, to a large extent, the main objective of all of the things that have happened at the international level. Indeed, we have been objects and subjects of international law from the very beginning. And really, the overall objective of all of the work that has taken place at the international level, at the United Nations, at the International Labor Organization, at the Organization of American States, is to regain that place in international law and in international relations, in international affairs, in intergovernmental dialogue. That really is the ultimate objective. In the way of human rights exercises, the standard-setting exercises, the whole objective was to bring our worldviews and our world perspectives, our specific cultural context into the world of human rights, the regime that was established by governments, or nation states more properly, in the area of human rights, to bring our worldview, bring our cultural context into this human rights system. It's a simple objective if you think about it. You don't need to understand much more than that. I mean, to understand, again, that we are objects and subjects of international law and international relations, and that we have a proper and legitimate and valid place at the table in all of these affairs. And we're not there yet. We have a long ways to go. If you look at it from the perspective of my people, the Inuit, throughout the Circumpolar region, we are not there yet. And I'll talk a little bit about that. In the area of human rights, it is about exercising and enjoying our rights. I remember some years ago at the United Nations, during the 40th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one of the speeches that was made by an Indigenous sister focused on, wouldn't it be something if we could really celebrate our right to life? I mean, we're talking about basic stuff. And this is on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They attach to us, but wouldn't it be something if we really did exercise and enjoy our right to the freedom of movement? I mean, these are really, really basic things, the exercise and enjoyment of our human rights. But in the case of Indigenous peoples, it really is more about altering and moving away from this nation state of mind that controls the international system right now, and the larger objective of regaining our sovereignty, regaining the full exercise of our right of self-determination on our own territories and according to our own customs, practices, and institutions. So we don't need new systems. We need to go back to our original systems. We call them old, but they're not old. They're here with us now. That's why I have a problem with the use of the term traditional knowledge. We're talking about indigenous knowledge. We're talking about it right here, right now, not something that is old or outdated or in a historical context. And I think it was best said by a Sami colleague of mine who spent some time in Alaska several years ago. And he summed it up in just a few lines. And it really does, I think, encapsulate the objective of the whole indigenous rights movement at the international level. He stated that indigenous peoples have a right to the past, we have a right to the present, and we have a right to the future. That says quite a lot if you think about it, as far as the objective of what's taking place at the international level. To honor and continue our rights as far as the past is concerned, our present conditions, and our future generations. In regard to the developments that have taken place, many of you probably are familiar with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the initial resolution that was put in place to establish the Working Group on Indigenous Populations, which had the twofold mandate of surveying the status and conditions of Indigenous peoples across the world, number one, and number two, to begin the drafting of a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this twofold mandate was taken very seriously by 5 independent human rights experts that comprised the Working Group on Indigenous Populations. At the very early stages of the WGIP, there were probably about as many Indigenous peoples in the meeting room as there are in this room right now, which is all to say that there were very few. Because of this, and I regard the UN Voluntary Fund as this Indigenous-specific mandate. We always talk about 3 mandates, but there are actually 4, in my opinion. And the fact that the Voluntary Fund was established to ensure that Indigenous peoples, those who didn't have the ways and means to get to the United Nations in order to participate, to share their stories and their experiences, were unable to do so because they didn't have any funds. So the Voluntary Fund was established by the United Nations to ensure that those that didn't have the capacity, didn't have the ability, didn't have the access to financial resources in particular to apply to the Voluntary Fund, again, as an Indigenous-specific mandate, so they could gain the support to attend these meetings that were of relevance to them. In the earliest days, it was quite restrictive. The resolution indicated that it should be only for the purposes of the Working Group on Indigenous Populations. And it also included a range of other elements that were very, very restrictive and prescriptive in terms of the states. First of all, voluntary. That it relied upon the voluntary contributions of governments. And to this day, it continues to rely upon the voluntary contributions of governments. And I don't know about the government of Canada, but the government of the United States has given one of the most affluent countries on earth, right? I think that the last time I looked, which was a while ago, they had only given $200 to the Voluntary Fund. And that was by virtue of a diplomat who just felt so guilty that he reached into his own pocket and pulled out $200 and made a contribution. So that's what I mean when I say voluntary. Maybe the record has changed since that time, but very restrictive in terms of the mandate in 1985. And it was specifically to support those who wanted to go to the working group. Its resolution 56-140 was expanded to ensure that once other mandates like the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues were created, that it could be expanded so that people could apply to attend the Permanent Forum annual sessions. But again, very restrictive, very prescriptive as far as how to apply and for what purposes. So as it notes here, the mandate and the purpose is to provide financial and technical assistance to Indigenous peoples now to attend the Permanent Forum. It was further enhanced by Resolution 63/161 in 2008 to include the expert mechanism and surprisingly also the Human Rights Treaty Body activities, the Universal Periodic Review, and the Human Rights Council sessions. And so it mirrors the developments in terms of the expansion of UN activities concerning Indigenous peoples specifically. But again, in my opinion, it's somewhat narrowly defined as far as access. If there were, in fact, increased number of financial contributions, as well as a much more fluid or open and flexible mechanism by which Indigenous peoples could apply to utilize such funds, I think it would be an improvement, a huge improvement. The reason why I include the International Labor Organization here is because this is an example where it is very restrictive. The International Labor Organization and Convention number 169, which is an important instrument and is in fact linked to the UN Declaration as well as the American Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, has an extremely important recourse mechanism that can result in concrete decisions by the committee that provides oversight to the convention. So I would suggest that in the area of Indigenous human rights, and not just ILO Convention number 169, the Voluntary Fund should provide resources to Indigenous peoples to bring issues to the International Labor Organization. They are Indigenous rights, but at this moment in time, all of the resolutions that have provided the mandate and the purpose of the Voluntary Fund are restricted basically to the key institutions that are named in the resolutions that have been adopted in relation to the Voluntary Fund. And finally, of course, the contributions from governments who are have been the largest donors. I would have to say that sometimes there are strings attached, and I'll give you an example. The Russian Federation gave a contribution to the Voluntary Fund at one point of $200,000. They had expected that, and I was a member of the Board of Trustees of the Voluntary Fund at the time, and there are others that have been invited to speak here. I know Claire Charters is now presently a member of the Board of Trustees. The Russian Federation kind of expected some results, some interest, some way of, ensuring that there were a certain number of Russian, well, their handpicked Russian indigenous participants that were able to attend various different activities or would be selected. And I think Alexei would know kind of what I'm talking about in terms of the treatment of indigenous peoples in the Russian Federation. And some of you may know about the history of the Russian Association of Small Nations of the North in the Russian Federation. But at any rate, I have more commentary about the Voluntary Fund and how it should be composed and whatnot, but I think it's something to think about in terms of that particular mandate, and or for Indigenous people to think of it as a mandate, because once you get a charismatic and amplified voice as far as Indigenous representatives are concerned, once you fund them and get them there, imagine the difference that they can make in any dialogue. So to think about it as a mandate, not just some funding mechanism on behalf of Indigenous peoples, I think is important to do. The UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, established in 2000, we have several people in the room that have been members of the Permanent Forum. I was fortunate to serve for the Arctic region along the same lines with Ed John, Chief John, when he was nominated from the North American region. So established in 2000, and its mandate, I have a lot of things to say about this. Now that I've been in sort of the trenches, I won't get into too much about it, but essentially it is, at the international level, one of the mandates that has probably been cited the most because of the composition of the Permanent Forum. It is remarkable that 16 members, 8 nominated by Indigenous peoples, serve in equity or equally and with equal status to 8 elected nation-state members. You know, if our drive is to move away from this nation-state of mind, here's a perfect example that you have Indigenous people sitting in equity with nation-state members to provide advice and recommendations to the Council, the Economic and Social Council, and to influence everything that goes on within the United Nations generally. As it states here, raise awareness and promote the integration and coordination of activities within the United Nations concerning Indigenous peoples. I think the simple way to say this is its mandate originally was to saturate the whole United Nations system with the views and perspectives of Indigenous peoples. And fortunately, the Permanent Forum has taken on the the mission of trying to be responsive to this mandate through a human rights framework. And to some extent, it has been successful. The 6 mandated areas of the Permanent Forum are listed here, and they have done a range of activities related to every single one of these issues, but oftentimes, obviously, because the nature of human rights is that they are interrelated, interdependent, and indivisible, many of the recommendations, studies, and activities of the Permanent Forum have touched upon every single one of these 6 mandated areas. I want to say that as far as its background and the history of it, you know, there's this, oh, I don't know how it happens. It's just a kind of a social behavior thing. A lot of people claim credit for many things that happen at the United Nations in terms of initiatives, resolutions, outcomes, and so forth. But I've traced back the history of the creation of the Permanent Forum specifically to an Inuit woman, the late Henrietta Rasmussen, who was present at the 1993 World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna. And as many of you may know, the Permanent Forum arose out of the Vienna Declaration and the program of action that was adopted in 1993. And as I said earlier, when you invite a charismatic and assertive individual, they can change the course of history. Well, Henrietta, at the World Conference on Human Rights, happened to mention that Indigenous peoples need a permanent place at the United Nations. And the resolution that emerged and the mandate in the Vienna Declaration actually makes that specific reference. So the government of Denmark, Henrietta, an Inuk from Greenland, or Kalaalleq Nunaat, she uttered those words at the World Conference, and it made its way into the declaration. You can read through the paragraphs related to Indigenous peoples in the Vienna Declaration. That's the very final line under those paragraphs concerning Indigenous peoples and human rights. And next thing you know, the government of Denmark and one of the most brilliant ambassadors that the UN has ever seen, Tui Lehmann, the Danish ambassador, took this very seriously and single-handedly, even though there were all these different working groups and dialogue and discussion and debates and a lot of states sitting on the fence over creating a permanent forum for Indigenous peoples within the UN, if it were not for Tui Lehmann as the Danish ambassador to passionately lead this whole effort, we probably wouldn't have a permanent forum on Indigenous issues. And if it were not for Henrietta Rasmussen uttering the words that Indigenous peoples need a permanent place at the United Nations, we may not have had it, or certainly not in the form that it happens to have right now. So it is an extraordinary development. And as far as some of the issues related to the Permanent Forum, it is quite significant that we've had the achievement of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's highly significant that the Permanent Forum utilizes that as its guideline, or that particular framework of human rights as its guideline in order to, again, saturate the UN system with the human rights perspectives of Indigenous people. So as far as its work is concerned, though, I think it's been uneven. I think that more can be done. In fact, I remember when Chief Littlechild was a member, one of the very first members, the inaugural member of the Permanent Forum. And after just a short period of time, him asking some questions about, what do you think we should do? What should the Permanent Forum do? And this is as far back as, what, 2002, 2003? To become more effective, instead of just, you know, being a bunch of talking heads at the United Nations, what can we do to be more effective and to take on some concrete initiatives. My initial response was, well, I think you should not have a public meeting, of which Indigenous peoples would scream and shout about if we didn't have a public forum for them to come and express their rights and concerns, but to turn around and turn inside the United Nations itself and begin putting all these specialized agencies and organs to work on what they can be doing in a concrete fashion to realize the rights of Indigenous peoples and our exercise and our enjoyment of them. Not to be focused on just a forum that allows, you know, a 2-minute speaking opportunity for an Indigenous person that has scraped up all the bits and pennies they can to come from Brazil or Australia or wherever else and barely have an opportunity to have an impact. I mean, and I think we need to think about this in a critical way as far as, are we making the best use of not only the permanent forum, but all of the Indigenous-specific mechanisms. I think that, for example, during my term there, we tried to institute some things, including possibly some important and scathing exit reports, so that, for example, when a government hosted an intersessional meeting of the permanent forum, that after we had a chance to meet with and hear from Indigenous peoples in a particular country, issue a report that says, hey, we had a look around, thanks for hosting us and spending all this money to get us here and making sure of our security in your country, but by the way, you know, you have some serious human rights violations going on. How come we didn't have a chance to go visit this community, that community, so on and so forth? But I want to say also, there's a lot more I could say about this mandate and how it could use some improvement. For example, the role of the Secretariat. The Secretariat and the, imagine if you're placed in the United Nations as an Indigenous person, and not only do you have a salary, but you have a budget. Any Indigenous person in this room would start thinking, oh man, they would probably think about a lot of creative and innovative ways to, you know, kick some ass, right? You know, you have an opportunity. And this is the kind of position that, I mean, if you have this position, yeah, there might be boundaries, but you know, it's 2019. Rules can be broken. Things can be done in terms of responding to the purpose and the mandate of this specific procedure within the United Nations. So the role of the Secretariat could become much more advocacy-oriented. There is also an interagency support group. Now, I have a lot of criticisms about this interagency support group. Too often, all these specialized agencies who are all culled together in this interagency support group end up doing what they want to do. Not what Indigenous peoples need, not what happens to be urgent for an Indigenous people, nation, or community. So some critical analysis and some critical thinking has to be done about this particular Indigenous-specific mandate. The UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I think that I don't want to say much here because we have the current sitting Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples with us, Vicky Talley-Corpus, who is going to, I'm sure, illuminate a wide range of things as far as what her mandate happens to be. It is useful and important that a anthropologist, the first special rapporteur, Rodolfo Stavenhagen, the man in the middle there, set the stage in terms of providing, from an anthropological perspective, the sort of broad contours of Indigenous peoples within the United Nations system. Indigenous peoples just generally, in terms of their status and conditions. You should know that Rodolfo Stavenhagen did this also within the Organization of American States, that he created an opportunity to educate states about Indigenous peoples. James Anaya, the individual that succeeded Rodolfo Stavenhagen, really created an important legal framework for the Special Rapporteur's office, and really drilled into what you might characterize as an expert commentary on the content, the substance of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And now Vicky Talley-Corpus has been, I would characterize her as an advocate, as a spokesperson and advocate, which I'm sure many states, including her own, don't fully appreciate. But I know Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities absolutely do. So as far as that mandate is concerned, I think it's important to know that in addition to this range of focusing on good practices, doing the country reports, doing communications in concert with the other special procedures, mandates, thematic studies, of which I'm sure she'll address to some extent, and also the communications that she carries forward in terms of her annual reports. They have all had some dynamic impact on the work of the United Nations in terms of Indigenous peoples, and more importantly, the violations and the gross violations of human rights that Indigenous peoples continue to face day to day. I should say that as far as the Special Rapporteur, the Permanent Forum, and now the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples are concerned, that actually, no, I'll hold off on a little bit on the commentary on that after I discuss the expert mechanism. So the expert mechanism, in terms of its historical antecedents, the Working Group on Indigenous Populations was a body of the Commission on Human Rights and the Subcommission on Discrimination, what is it, the Discrimination, I've forgotten the full name of it now, the Subcommission on Discrimination and Protection of Minorities. Yeah. It was a long title. But the Working Group on Indigenous Populations was the mechanism that was created to deal with the Declaration, and was really at the service of the Commission on Human Rights, its parent body. And when the Declaration was adopted, the Working Group on Indigenous Populations was dissolved. And in the context of reform of the human rights system in the United Nations came the creation of the termination or disbanding of the Commission on Human Rights and the creation of the Human Rights Council, which was supposed to really create some reform in the area of human rights generally for everybody, and for Indigenous peoples likewise. So in response to kind of filling this gap that was left by the conclusion of the work on the Declaration and the conclusion of the Working Group on Indigenous Populations, was the creation of the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples in 2007 to provide advice and expertise to the Human Rights Council itself. And I won't say much more about that because we have 3 of the current seated, 4. Okay, 4 members. So we practically have we have a quorum, I should say, maybe, of the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples, the members that are here with us, so I'll yield to them. But this expert mechanism and the opportunities that exist, I didn't realize that I set it up this way, but the opportunities that exist as far as the expert mechanism is concerned, and having the ear of the Human Rights Council, because we presently have so many issues that are really about human rights and human rights violations. Yes, we are talking about other issues of relevance to Indigenous peoples within the Permanent Forum and elsewhere, but to gain the implementation of the rights affirmed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the expert mechanism is perfectly poised to, again, amplify our opportunities as far as the Human Rights Council is concerned. I just wanted to go through a number of things as far as, in my view, at least what some of the challenges happen to be. I've already covered the voluntary nature of contributions to the UN Voluntary Fund. I think that there should actually be something much more firm and concrete instituted within the United Nations to ensure that they're not voluntary contributions, that there is a certain percentage of the dues of countries. And not solely those countries that have indigenous peoples within their borders, right? And that's a problem in and of itself, especially when your people transcend national borders. But for every country, because the concerns of indigenous people should be concerns of every country, of everyone. And so I think that as far as the voluntary fund is concerned, there should be an obligation to provide on an annual basis funds to the voluntary fund to further advance the work of indigenous peoples. As far as the mandates and strategic use of the treaty bodies, so we have had the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples since 2007. So adopted on September 13th, 2007 by the General Assembly. Yet every single day here in Canada, one of the more progressive countries, at least you have some basic democratic principles and the rule of law in this nation, but you still have human rights violations concerning indigenous peoples. You know, so, I mean, it's all relative. Think of the places where you know, the countries where there is no basic rule of law, where there are no democratic principles. I mentioned the Russian Federation earlier. Look at the situations in China and elsewhere. I think we need much more strategic use of the treaty bodies, of the Universal Periodic Review, and of the Human Rights Council itself. And you read back, you look at some of these things that happened, certainly within the International Labor Organization some time ago. It's just stunning. If you think of it, let me just say, out of the preamble of the Constitution of the International Labor Organization, it actually says, whereas universal and lasting peace can be established only if it is based upon social justice. As an indigenous person, think about that and what social justice means. That's the Constitution of the ILO. I mean, we have incredible opportunities to really advance things in terms of the treaty bodies, the UPR, and the Human Rights Council, and for us to all think more strategically about it. And at one point in time when I was on the forum, the idea of the joint statements of all these mechanisms and how can we align the permanent forum, the special rapporteur, the expert mechanism, and those that have benefited from the voluntary fund into joint statements that really raise alarm as far as some of the issues and concerns go for indigenous peoples. Obviously, implementation of the declaration, which is the subject of this particular conference, but I would like to say that more important than the work in the halls of the United Nations, I have to face this, and I know every indigenous nation, community, or peoples faces this question, is that the expense and the priorities of your people, are you making more of an impact right at home at the national level than you are at the international level, in the halls of New York, in the halls of Geneva? I really do think there needs to be an emphasis on the national dialogue, the national debate. If we added up all the funds that we've expended and all the energy we've expended at the international level over these, 3-4 decades now, and turn that attention to our national capitals, what kind of impact would it have? This is all to say that it's still important to have this international dialogue and to regain our place in terms of the international legal order, but at the same time, this dialogue at the national level is crucial and important. I'm going to skip over the next. I want to make note of the commentary by the ILO itself. I don't think we talk about the ILO convention very much. I think it is not really understood or known widely, especially outside of the 22 countries that have ratified the convention. But what I want to point out is that the ILO itself has recognized that it is linked to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The ILO itself has stated that the UN Declaration, the ILO Convention number 169 are mutually reinforcing and compatible. And we then, any Indigenous advocate, any human rights advocate working with Indigenous people should be thinking about the standards contained in both the ILO Convention, also the UN Declaration, and I would submit as well the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was adopted by the OAS in 2016. How much? Cut it off? Yeah. Okay, just two more things. There's a development that's taking place, and I saw it recently in the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement debate, and the creation of this platform on Indigenous peoples within the Paris Agreement, or in the context of the Paris Agreement. I said this at the 2017 conference in Denver. I asked Claire Charters, Jim and I, others, don't you guys think there's a problem with this issue of local communities and Indigenous peoples? You know, there's this linkage to the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity the Secretariat uses. And it has its historical antecedents in the 1992 World Conference on Environment and Development in Rio. Because in the background, at the UN Declaration drafting exercise, we had not come to an agreement about the use of the term peoples because of, oh my God, they might want to exercise the right of self-determination. So in Rio, and the Rio Declaration introduced these terms, local communities and Indigenous peoples, linked us together. Now we're facing this problem, and it's been a consistent problem. And it's governments like China. It was the government of China and the UNFCCC discussions, just in December, not even a month ago, that insists that, no, there aren't Indigenous peoples in China. Local communities and Indigenous peoples is the only thing that we'll accept. Oh, you should know, as any Canadian in the room, is the government of Canada who fought the fight for us. They're the ones who were at the helm, and it was Inuit Circumpolar Council who was pushing and pushing and pushing and saying, don't go for this stuff, in terms of diminishing the status of Indigenous peoples in this larger context of local communities. Now, local communities, I can think of Iceland, right? You know, we talk about the Arctic Council in Iceland. Yeah, there's local knowledge, local communities, but Indigenous peoples are different. Their rights are different. Their status is different. And I think that this is going to be a huge, huge problem in the future. The final thing that I want to say is that for all of us, there is insufficient monitoring of all of these different activities. Nobody is paying close attention to what's going on in every single arena. And states are exploiting the fact that Indigenous peoples are absent, or we do not have Indigenous people schooled in human rights seated at the table. And so we have to be vigilant about what is happening at all these various different international fora and not treat these things as a silo. And this is what governments tend to do, is that, you know, they forget that their own government has made an obligation, a solemn commitment in the context of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and they conveniently forget about it. I've seen it at the International Whaling Commission. Our communities are subsistence whaling. IWC, even though they all may be Latin American diplomats, they got no clue that their own counterparts have been the chairpersons to these different fora to bring about the UN Declaration, to bring about the OAS Declaration. So my main point here is that there's a silo or an approach to just silo these activities and to do things quietly and secretly. And I just wish we had more and more and more Indigenous peoples to pay attention to what's happening at these various different fora in order for us to ensure our direct participation and also to actively exercise and enjoy our rights as Indigenous peoples. The final thing to say is that all of this activity, every single mandate, every single study, every single resolution that's adopted, every single declaration that's adopted by the General Assembly, by virtue of the reality of Indigenous peoples, by virtue of our status, by virtue of our distinct rights, every single one of these documents that emerges has a legal effect. I've heard people say, oh yeah, well, the Sustainable Development Goals, there isn't a legal effect there. Anytime anything is raised in relation to Indigenous peoples and our rights, it has a legal effect. And the jurisprudence that has come out of the Canadian Supreme Court and any other court, any other human rights treaty body, we have to pay attention to it and to take the time to read these things carefully, think about them critically, and amplify the outcomes of every single one of these various different instruments. So I didn't get a chance to talk about what's going on in the Arctic, but Kuyana Sawak for your attention here.